Hey guys, Tech Ranger with the video for you guys. In today's video, we're going to compare the new iPhone 14 Pro with the iPhone XS Max that was released 4 years ago. In this video, we're going to talk about the software, the hardware, the camera, battery, performance, and overall comparison between these two phones that you might want to know if you're considering upgrading from the iPhone XS Max to the iPhone 14 Pro, or simply just want to know what the differences are, or if you're in the market for it, what the pros and cons are between these two devices. So let's dive right into it. As you can see here, this isn't going to be the greatest comparison, considering that the iPhone XS Max is the Max version, with the iPhone 14 Pro it's the regular 14 Pro, not the Max version. There is the Max version that you can buy on the 14 Pro Max for the biggest size, but we wanted to do this comparison just so you can see how much things have changed in terms of the Max versus the Pro lineup. So first thing first is the size here. As you can see here, the 14 Pro has a 6.1 inch display here versus the Max, which is the biggest for its lineup, which is 6.7 inch display. Now both of the displays are Super Retina display, but there's slight difference. This is an XDR display on the 14 Pro versus the HD display, and then on the 14 Pro you got things like ProMotion and then always on technology, which you can see here right here. When you turn off the power button, it's always on. You can turn that off, but along with that is the ProMotion of the 120 hertz or refresh rate versus only 60 hertz refresh rate on the iPhone XS Max here. Also on the phone here, of course, you might already seen, but notice here is the notch and the dynamic island. So on the new 14 Pro, Apple redesigned that top notch to be what's known as the dynamic island, versus on the XS Max, of course, you get that all that state of it on the display here. A quick thing to mention along with that in terms of hardware is on the 14 Pro you have this built-in sensors to allow the phone to detect if you're in a crash based on the sensors built into it. Basically, if you're in a severe crash, it will call emergency service. Unfortunately, that's not available on the iPhone XS Max, even with the latest iOS 16 update here. So those are going to be the other thing. Now let's turn to the back, where we can really discuss some other key differences here between it. First thing first, of course, you'll notice the color differences. We have the silver one, and both of the phones do come in silver color. They come in gold. They also come in what's known as a space black, basically the midnight or the graphite version of the other darker shade of color. But on the newer iPhone 14 Pro introduces a new color, which is this deep purple color, which we unboxed. So if you guys want to check that out, this is the newest color that you can get. But unfortunately for the XS Max, you only get those 3 base colors for the phone. Now, if color is something that matters to you. The next thing you also notice is the camera. Of course, on the new 14 Pro, you got an upgraded camera of 48 megapixel and then 12 megapixel camera. Fortunately, on the iPhone XS Max, you only get 12 megapixel camera, and later on we'll talk about in terms of what sort of features are available between these cameras when you actually use the camera when it comes to both of these two phones. The other noticeable difference here I want to kind of mention for you guys is the build of the phone itself. So if you look closely between the phones built here, you notice here this is the round built edge, where starting with the iPhone 12 and later, Apple switched over to flat bezel, and that's kind of the design for the 14 Pro as well. The other thing, of course, physically, if you want to take a look at it and mention between these two phones, it's that there is no longer a SIM tray, physical SIM tray on the iPhone 14 Pro in the US model. So all the phones that you get on the 14 lineup have no physical SIM, so you have to activate it through eSIM, versus iPhone XS Max, which still has that physical SIM card right here where the hole is. Along with the difference between these two phones is 5G on the 14 Pro that's available starting with the iPhone 12 lineup. Fortunately, iPhone XS Max does not have 5G capability, so if your carrier is starting to do 5G support, fortunately the XS Max will not be able to utilize that technology. The reason why we mentioned physical SIM versus the eSIM on the 14 Pro is that if you're taking the phone international travel, some countries do not have that capability yet, and they might be lagging behind. So that's where the 14 Pro Max probably wins over the iPhone 14 Pro versus, of course, the XS Max. So let's go ahead and talk about other things between these two phones. It's going to be the battery life between these two phones. Of course, both of the phones have massive batteries, which is kind of given, considering the XS Max usually has the bigger size battery. But when it comes to actually video playback, you get about 23 hours of video playback on the 14 Pro, which is considered almost all day battery. So if you're if you're medium to heavy user, most of the time you can go with a full single charge. On the iPhone XS Max here, you get about 15 hours of video playback. Again, that's a big difference, considering that's almost an 8-hour difference between the video playback and the capability you get between these two phones. Other thing to mention in terms of hardware is the chipset built on it. Of course, with the latest version and the newest technology out, the iPhone 14 Pro features that A16 Bionic chip with 6 gigs of RAM, where the iPhone XS Max here lags behind. Of course, it's a 4-year-old phone. Again, features that A12 Bionic chipset with 4 gigs of RAM. Again, in terms of performance, we notice there is a slight increase in performance in the iPhone 14 Pro when we did some testing, and it matters when it comes to heavy graphic game, where the iPhone 14 Pro does better when it comes to graphic heavy games that are meant to be played on the console here. Other than that, most basic apps for both of the phones will run about the same for you, whether you're running now social media app, entertainment app, any of those apps. And the other thing we want to mention is software version on both of the phones. So both of the phones have the capability to, of course, run iOS 16. iOS 16 natively built for the iPhone 14 Pro and the iPhone 14 lineup, where the iPhone XS Max still can use the iOS 16 and take advantage of all the features that you can get on it for the most part here. Of course, that's impressive considering that this is a 4-year phone, and Apple generally supports most of their iPhones for about 5 to 6 years of major updates. So expect the iPhone XS Max to get another 2 years of update, possibly 1, depending on how aggressive Apple gets, where the iPhone 14 Pro at least another 5 years without really having to worry about it. Now let's move on to the next big items, which is the camera here. So when it comes to camera, as you know, Apple does a phenomenal job because the way they kind of design their phone, their focus is on the camera. So what kind of camera differences you'll notice here? Of course, both of the phones does have the same great quality phones, but you notice here 15x versus 10x to zoom. Things like portrait mode will be available on both phones, no doubt here. But when you start to move into things like videography, this is where things start to set apart. Of course, both phones can record up to 4K 60 frames per second, so you do get 4K still on up to 60 frames per second on this one. But one thing you'll notice here besides that is this new action mode that's available only on the iPhone 14 Pro and the 14 Pro Max lineup. So that's a big upgrade on the camera itself, and this kind of helps the phone stabilizes when you're recording on the go. So if you're really trying to get those pictures, this is on the go. This is where the stabilization comes in play. The next feature difference between is the cinematic mode, which again, this was actually introduced in the previous 13 lineup that we've seen here, but cinematic mode unfortunately is not available on the 14 Pro here. Other things like a night mode, Pro RAW are only available on the 14 Pro, unfortunately not on the iPhone XS Max. So those are going to be some differences between both of the phones that when it comes to camera that we like to mention for you guys. So now let's move on to another hardware differences between these two phones that's important to note is that the base storage on both of the phones are slightly different. So the iPhone 14 Pro now starts at 128 GB of the base storage. Now you can go all the way up to 1 terabyte. The iPhone XS Max, on the other hand, starts at 64 gig but goes up to only 512 gig maximum storage that you can get. Of course, you can use things like the Cloud Plus and other subscription services to upload and save your photos and videos. But if you're a person that likes to keep everything locally, and 1 terabyte might be what you're looking at, but you do pay almost close to $1,500 for that 1 terabyte. But both of the phones originally when came out started at $999 for it, but something to worth mention. Now, finally, let's move on to the software aspect of it. We quickly mentioned both phones, again, run to the latest version of the software. And when it comes to most of your popular apps, right, both of the phones does exceptional job just being able to do what it's good for in terms of when it comes to your social media apps, streaming app, music app, video, all gaming apps. All of that will run smoothly, no doubt. We haven't had any issues even on the XS Max running the latest version of it, and that's great to hear because of 4-year-old phone being so much stable that it is good. Of course, both of the phones does the basic stuff well, which is calling, texting, right, of the phones. iPhone, even the iPhone 6 still does a great job doing the basic stuff. So it's kind of the neat thing about the iPhones, of course, that makes it great. Now let's talk about why you might consider the iPhone XS Max versus considering the iPhone 14 Pro. So one big thing about the iPhone XS Max here, of course, just purely on size, you got 0.4 inch bigger size. So it's a bigger size when it comes to gaming, makes a big difference. Also, this isn't a fair comparison considering that the iPhone 14 Pro has the Max version as well. The other thing we want to mention here, again, it's the eSIM versus a physical SIM, because like we mentioned, going out of the country where countries or areas that don't support eSIM yet, you might be better off with the physical SIM here. And lastly is the price between these two phones. Of course, we mentioned the 14 Pro, you can only buy it from Apple, and the discount isn't really there. You're going to pay $1,000 at the bare minimum. With iPhone XS Max, if you're buying it pre-owned, which pretty much on Amazon or eBay are the only way to get this in pre-owned, you can score this phone for around $200 to $300, almost a fraction of the cost you pay for the 14 Pro. So price, budget-wise, that's where the iPhone, of course, XS Max comes in play. Now, talking about the 14 Pro, what are the upgrades you're getting if you're considering the 14 Pro or thinking of upgrading? Of course, we mentioned the display here, upgraded display. It's about 1800 brightness nit. So when it comes to brightness, this is where the 14 Pro does so well with the newer version of display on it, versus only 1800 versus around 600. 60 nit on the iPhone XS Max. Of course, the refresh rate, 128 refresh rate, and that upgraded 6 gig of RAM with the A16 Bionic gig. When we started to do some to benchmark testing, we saw that almost 80% better performance in terms of some of the benchmark that we have taken. Of course, along with that is the upgraded battery. You get about, as we mentioned, 23 hours versus only 15 hours. So that's almost a 42% longer battery life. You also get the latest version of the Wi-Fi 6 technology available, newer version of Bluetooth as well, which again, minor differences here. Upgraded camera, as we mentioned, with some of those newer features that won't be available on the 14 Pro versus the iPhone XS Max. You also get this hidden thing which is known as LPDDR5, which is basically faster memory type. So when it comes to processing and saving and storing stuff, this is where the iPhone 14 Pro does well in. Besides that, of course, both of the phones, again, are still great devices in 2022 and will be for the next year as well. So we want to hear from you guys. What's your thought between these two phones? Which phone would you choose, or if you've been using, what's your experience been like? If you upgraded from one to another, leave a comment in the comment section. Thanks for watching, guys. See you guys next time.